what could have been, what should have been, what might have been. The laments over the failure of the WCW invasion angle in 2001 continue a full generation later as distraught fans still metaphorically throw themselves onto the storyline's open casket like hysterically grieving relatives that can't get a hold of themselves. The WWE vs WCW Holy War should have been the most talked about feud in the history of professional wrestling, and I guess in its defense, in some way, we are still talking about it, aren't we? Once Shane McMahon bought the deed to the fallen Turner Empire out from under his father's nose in a truly surreal bit of television, it would take a little longer to kick off the forthcoming war. WCW interlopers such as Lance Storm, Hugh Morris, Stacy Keibler, and Diamond Dallas Page delivered the early salvos, with Booker T, Mike Awesome, and the rest of the available horde storming them at Castle, all rules tossed aside. The frenzy in that extended preamble would sadly cast a large shadow over the ensuing chapters, as we all know. And by the time the invasion died that November with ECW hastily buried in the same mass grave, 2 bullet holes in the back of its skull, all that anybody could say was what a waste. A waste of opportunity, a waste of interest, a waste of potential money, a total and utter waste. I'm Sam from Cultaholic.com, and here are 10 things you didn't know about the invasion. Join us! Number 10. Bish slapped. Part of the reason the invasion lacked a bit of potency was the lack of genuine stars at hand. Ric Flair, Goldberg, The Outsiders, Scott Steiner, Sting, none of them were to be found, and in fact all of that group but Sting would arrive in WWE within 18 months of the invasion's end. Another individual absent from the organised mayhem was Eric Bischoff, who, like most of the others, popped up long after the worms had started burrowing deep into WCW's hastily buried corpse. But Bischoff, instead of being a possible invader, could have been the savior. On January 11th, 2001, Bischoff, along with a group of investors from Fusient Media Ventures, signed a letter of intent to purchase the ailing WCW from Time Warner. However, in the midst of a 6-week diligence period before the sale would become final, Jamie Kellner, the new head of Turner Broadcasting, cancelled all WCW programming on his networks, effective later in March. With no TV deals in place, Bischoff and Fusient pulled out. Had Kellner not thrown the monumental spanner into the works, there may have never been an invasion. It would also turn out via a quick Google that Kellner was also responsible for cancelling Animaniacs, so he can eat a massive, steaming pile of Number 9. A real meathead move. 6 nights after Shane dropped the best bombshell in the world, that he bought WCW's grave remains out from under Daddy's nose, Shane O'Mac vanquished Vince in a wonderfully overbooked street fight at WrestleMania 17. You know the match, the one in which Linda McMahon feigned a sedative coma, rose up from her chair and kicked Vince in the nuts to one of the biggest pops in wrestling history. Simpler times. While few of us would trade that awesome finish for anything, the original plan was to see WCW get involved. According to Lance Storm, a cadre of WCW wrestlers was supposed to help Shane win the match, spiting the evil boss who worked to put them out of business. Instead, the WCW crew only watched the match from a luxury suite inside Houston's Astrodome. And by God, do they look bored. Jesus, look at them. That's because, according to Storm, Sean Stasiak blurted out the entire plan to a media outlet on the eve of WrestleMania, leading to a furious Vince to cancel the entire setup and almost nearly sent the entire WCW crew home. And that is why Stasiak's time in the invasion saw him portrayed as an inept bumbler. Number 8. Separate but equal? In April 2001, WWE absorbed the contracts of 24 different WCW on-air performers. From Storm to Keibler to Shane Helms to Sean O'Hare, among many other familiar faces. Others, such as Booker T, Tori Wilson, and Chris Kanyon, would come in later to different negotiations. On top of the 40 or 50 WWE regulars that were working at the time, that's a lot of talent to feature, and that's why we eventually got the original brand extension, to essentially find a way to feature such a staggering amount of wrestlers every week. But originally, WCW was supposed to end up being its own entity from within the WWE bubble, complete with its own weekly programming. WWE was actually prepared to let WCW have the Monday night time slot in Raw's place, while WWE would take SmackDown on the sorta major network UPN, thus creating 2 separate entities. According to Dave Meltzer, McMahon felt that WCW would need the primary wrestling night in order to re-establish itself, a plan that sounds sounds completely insane in hindsight. But those plans would fall through after the early negative reception to WCW-centric matches, particularly the ill-fated Booker T Buff Bagwell debacle in Tacoma, after which McMahon decided he couldn't run WCW as a standalone product. Number 7, Family Matters. So just how would WCW gain control of Monday Night Raw in order to launch their opposition program on WWE's time? Were they to win an enormous match like a War Games of some kind? There just had to be some sort of good explanation for Shane McMahon suddenly shooing away the WWE regulars and instead treating the Monday night audience to Johnny Stamboli versus Chuck Palumbo, right? And there was an interesting explanation. It would all be Linda McMahon's doing. On the night that Bagwell and Booker stank the joint out, Vince was in the midst of a rather creepy tryst with a scantily clad Tori Wilson making her WWE debut. The payoff was that Tori would help undress Vince and make him close his eyes, only for him to open them and see not Tori, but rather Linda. That was supposed to lead to Linda divorcing Vince and the division of assets. And in that division, Linda would gain control of Monday Night Raw. As a way to stick it to Vince, Linda would give Raw to Shane for him to run his WCW programming. But once Vince soured on WCW that night in Tacoma, the angle with Linda and Tori was dropped and never mentioned again. Number 6, tensions mount. There was already the little matter of integrating the incoming WCW talents with the WWE locker room, especially now that WWE chose to roll with the invasion angle instead of allowing WCW to be a separate show. Outside of Stasiak, who worked for WWE in 1999, nobody from the Survivors class had really been a part of the WWE environment before. WWE not only had their own way of doing things, but there were plenty of locker room officers looking for a reason to take exception to the outsiders. Jim Ross was head of talent relations at the time, and he vividly recalls what a challenging ordeal that situation was. He remembers there being a ton of insecurity and paranoia among the collective locker room at the time, quipping that he really needed to be Dr. Phil instead of JR. Between wrestlers having difficulty fitting in among spiteful cliques to wrestlers feeling job scared due to the overcrowded population, the WWE locker room must not have been the most joyous of places in 2001. Number 5, the fault in no stars. The most common criticism of the alliance was the lack of outside star power. It's not much of an invasion if you have to turn members of WWE's frontline heel in order to maximize the intrigue. Steve Austin, Kurt Angle, the Dudley Boys, and a handful of other McMahon Land notables all had to take up arms with the Rebel Army in order to swing the balance a bit closer to reasonable parity. The reason why so many WCW notables were absent was the result of their lucrative contracts, which were not being paid by WCW, but rather WCW's parent company, Time Warner. Goldberg, Sting, Ric Flair, Kevin Nash, and Scott Steiner were among those being paid unreal money to simply sit at home. And WWE was either unable to buy them out or just wasn't willing to do so. For what it's worth, both Booker T and Diamond Dallas Page agreed to be bought out due to their eagerness to take part in the angle. Which, well, let's just say that DDP would openly admit that he regretted doing that. Remember Sarah Undertaker? Number 4, an extreme mess. Arguably, the biggest highlight of the invasion wasn't anything that benefited the propped-up WCW, but rather the resurrection of ECW. In a rather exciting movement on the July 9th, 2001 episode of Raw, Tommy Dreamer and Rob Van Dam joined 8 WWE and WCW wrestlers that shared the same bingo hall background and commenced a beatdown of Kane and Chris Jericho. Then a phlegmy Paul Heyman sermoned about ECW's Lazarus-like rise from the beyond, and then Stephanie McMahon became the boss. So much for that. But that wasn't the only issue with the implementation of ECW. As it turned out, WWE did not have the legal right to use any ECW trademark, nor did the person who gave WWE the permission, former owner Paul Heyman. Several weeks before Rhino and Raven and the gang all donned black ECW shirts to signal the rebirth, ECW's assets were liquidated and under the ownership of a trustee that was not named Paul Heyman. The very name of The Alliance was a convenient catch-all for the WCW-ECW collective. And that was good because using the trademark ECW at that time was more trouble than it was worth. It should be noted that in January 2003, WWE acquired ECW's assets, which gave us great DVD documentaries and content, yay! One Night Stands 2005 and 2006, yay! And the WWE-ECW brand. Number 3, Theatre of War. But despite some misfires, questionable decisions and cosmetic changes, WWE pushed forward with the Invasion pay-per-view in July 2001. Counting a pre-show battle between Chavo Guerrero and Scotty 2 Hotty, WWE fought the hybrid WCW-ECW Brigade in 11 matches, with the Alliance winning the night by a score of 6-5. Notable moments included Austin's defection to the Alliance, Rob Van Dam looking like a megastar in his hardcore title match with Jeff Hardy, Trish Stratus nearly falling to a doom in the entrance set, and Earl Hebner entering to some angry-sounding thrash metal. Interest in the event was rather high, despite the issues that the Invasion had encountered before the night of the show. In all, Invasion pulled in a whopping 770,000 buys, making it the 15th most bought pay-per-view in WWE history. That fact would be impressive enough unto itself, but consider this. The 14 shows ahead of Invasion on the chart? All WrestleManias, yes. No SummerSlam, no Royal Rumble, and no Survivor Series has ever done as many pay-per-view buys as the lone Invasion. Truly, that night marked the pinnacle of that angle. Number 2, with a whimper. And now we go from the ecstasy to the agony. 4 months after the sought-after Invasion pay-per-view, the whole thing came to an end at Survivor Series 2001, with the Alliance being drummed out at the conclusion of the main event. Between Invasion and Survivor Series, the entire angle hit polar vortex levels of cooling off, and what was once a hotly anticipated be-all, end-all storyline becomes so disinteresting that it made a WBF pose-down look like an AEW ticket party. To give you an idea of how badly things had cooled off, consider that Survivor Series, which took place at the Coliseum in Greensboro, North Carolina. Said venue could hold more than 19,000 people and did 19,700 for the 1999 King of the Ring just 2.5 years earlier. Survivor Series, on the other hand, barely pulled in 10,000 fans, a fifth of which were comped. According to Figure 4 Weekly, a high amount of tickets, including for expensive lower-level seats, was still available just days before the pay-per-view. You know, the pay-per-view in which WWE or the WCW-ECW faction would be put out of business forever. Such high stakes, and yet WWE couldn't even sell half of the seats in the arena. And number 1, the numbers don't lie. Hang on, we're not done talking about Survivor Series. As noted, the Alliance was heavily watered down, with one WWE defection after another, to the point where the group was basically just a bunch of random heels with a shared goal: make Steve Austin and the McMahon children happy. Looking carefully at the Survivor Series 2001 card, you realize just how watered down things had gotten. Not counting WWE defections, or the 3 who essentially jumped ship from ECW's ashes, that's Rob Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer, and Jazz, only 9 of the wrestlers on the show came from the WCW wreckage, 8 of whom were relegated to the Immunity Battle Royal. For those keeping the score, said group consists of the Hurricane, DDP, Sean Stasiak, Lance Storm, and Billy Kidman, as well as WWE defection Chuck Palumbo and a pair of Alliance castoffs in Hugh Morris and Chavo Guerrero. The Alliance's representation on the rest of the card consisted almost entirely of WWE stars gone bad, as well as Rob Van Dam and Jazz, and one lone genuine WCW invader, Booker T, who took part in the 5-on-5 main event. You know, perhaps this entry should have been called With a Whimper. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments below. You can follow Cultaholic on Twitter @Cultaholic. You can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Cultaholic. If you like what we do here at Cultaholic, you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Cultaholic. And no matter what you do, don't ever forget to hit subscribe and join us.